Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD Culture and Stigma, a podcast devoted to exploring how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. I'm a writer and teacher with a history of BPD. In Through the Looking Glass, the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, Alice shares this exchange with Humpty Dumpty. Must a name mean something? Alice asked doubtfully. Of course it must, Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh. My name means the shape I am, and a good handsome shape it is, too. With a name like yours, you might be any shape almost. The name borderline personality disorder shapes our perception of it. It's a metaphor. Borderline nods to the facts that people with this disorder dwell in a liminal state between psychosis and neurosis in medical terms, and that the experience of it overlaps with other mental health problems, including depression and PTSD. Some people don't think borderline is a good, handsome shape of a name and have proposed that we adopt the term emotionally unstable personality disorder. Personally, I think that sounds worse. George Lakoff argued that we rely on conceptual metaphors to understand our whole world, including fundamental concepts like time and love. For example, we slice time's daily pie into 24 pieces as it flies, is wasted, or runs out. Similarly, we pepper the language of mental infirmity with metaphors, asking shrinks to help us screw our heads on straight and battle our personal demons. Some scholars have argued that mental illness is metaphorized by its very nature because we borrow the terminology of physical illness, including prognosis and symptoms, for conditions that are very different than catching a cold or coming down with the flu. More metaphors. But as Ronald Pies writes, just because we might disagree with using certain phrases to describe mental illness, such as saying someone with schizophrenia has a sick mind, it doesn't mean that schizophrenia isn't a real and painful illness like cancer or lupus. We use a lot of metaphors to describe BPD. Marsha Linehan, who created dialectical behavior therapy to treat BPD and suffered from it herself, used this one. People with BPD are like people with third-degree burns over 90% of their bodies. Lacking emotional skin, they feel agony at the slightest touch. Okay, technically, it's a simile. There's like in there. Still, this simile has helped me to convey to friends and family what it feels like to have BPD. Other metaphors, like psycho girlfriend, say more about the speaker than the borderline experience to me. As a creative writer, I will always use metaphors to describe the experience of mental illness, and in doing so, I may brush up against what some feel are the limits of decorum. I think this brush is inevitable and necessary. After all, the term mental illness signifies an experience of life that falls outside the norm, and the metaphors we use to capture it might be alien, might be horrific, and might be offensive to some people, even as the language serves to continue a conversation that may ultimately destigmatize it. I see the BPD Rabbit by Plushie Dreadfuls in this light. This predominantly pink and white stuffed animal is about a foot tall and has silky, purple-lined ears. A silver bolt breaks its heart in two while stitches bind its face, alluding to unstable relationships and a penchant for self-harm. You can unzip its ticking bomb backpack, a symbol of mood reactivity, to reveal two mini bunnies, one black and one white, which represent the black and white thinking common to people with BPD. The BPD rabbit is a cuddly metaphor that draws on the lived experience of hundreds of people who offered feedback on social media during the extensive crowd design process. Still, there are others who find it offensive. I can understand that reaction, but I love my rabbit. It reminds me of the Velveteen Rabbit and how love can make something real, and how a person with a real affliction can still be loved. In this episode, I'll be sharing the first part of a conversation with American McGee, founder of Plushie Dreadfuls and designer of the popular video games American McGee's Alice and Alice: Madness Returns. In this first half of our interview, he and I talk about how trauma translates into art, the crowd design process for the BPD Rabbit and other mental health Plushie Dreadfuls, and the line between a metaphor and a stereotype. We were just talking a little bit about your Alice games. The main focus of this interview will be about American's Plushie Dreadfuls line and specifically the BPD Rabbit. But what I didn't know when I first found out about the Rabbit was that you also, had this extensive career as a video game designer, and you designed 2 games based on or inspired by Alice in Wonderland. I read somewhere that your childhood influenced your Alice games, and I was just saying that I think there's also shreds of Alice or just fairy tales in general in the whole concept of the Plushie Dreadfuls. Why is Alice in Wonderland in particular kind of a touchstone for you, or fairy tales in general?
Yeah, well, they are all connected together. The Plushie Dreadfuls, in fact, derive from the Alice story.
Okay.
But as to the why of Alice, I did start off in the games industry at the early stages of when 3D games were coming into existence. I worked on games like Doom and Quake. And after having worked for some years on these games that are not a lot of story going on in them. It's basically pick up the gun and shoot the monsters and then, repeat until the end. When I had an opportunity to make a game of my own and to use those same 3D engines, which were still primarily being used for sort of space marine adventure type games, I did decide to draw on my personal childhood experiences with trauma and try to bring that into the game space and to tell story in games in a way that was still relatively unknown at that period in time. So we released the first Alice game in 2000, and it was a narrative-driven action-adventure game where you play the role of Alice. But what's happened to her is that she's lost her family in a fire mysteriously and has suffered great trauma mentally, as you would, as a result of that, and ends up being institutionalized. And then Wonderland becomes sort of the tool set that she uses to work through that trauma. The characters that she encounter on the first adventure represent various aspects of the trauma of grief and loss and pain and suffering that she's experiencing. And as she overcomes them in Wonderland, she's also overcoming them in these traumas in the mental space, and eventually works through to the end of that game to get herself released from the asylum. The second game in the series continues to explore those themes, but it digs deeper into the origins of the fire. And we find that her family didn't just die, that they were murdered, and that there is a nefarious psychologist that is behind all of this. And so it starts to delve more directly into some of the themes of childhood abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse that were my inspirations in the first, in the development of the first game, but weren't fully sort of uncovered until the second game. And I think as a game series, they really resonated with a lot of people because they deal with very real issues of psychological trauma and childhood trauma, but they do it in a way that certainly for games isn't done very often. And there's a lot of metaphor. There's a lot of use of Jungian psychology connected to alchemy, connected to personal transformation, connected to inner child work, connected to, as we were discussing before the interview started, this notion of internal family systems, the sort of splitting up of your personality or of psychological elements of who you are into sort of competing voices or forces within you. All of that stuff is contained in the Alice games. And I think that's why there's a kind of depth to them that to this day, people are still playing the 20-year-old game or the 10-plus-year-old game and still finding a lot of meaning and even finding a lot of help in the story and in the adventure contained in those games.
Yeah, well, I can understand why. I was telling you I don't really play video games, but that one I might try because it sounds like it could be a really powerful, kind of empowering thing to go through the game. Have you ever seen any of the photos that Lewis Carroll took of children, including the girl who inspired Alice?
So as a general rule, I've tried to stay away from the whole concept and the whole conversation related to Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodgson. One of the reasons is that I'm using the Alice in Wonderland framework, but I'm not really in the universe that he created. This notion that the parents died in a fire, it's supposed to be that happened to the real Alice in a sense, although of course we're creating our own narrative universe, but this is an alternate timeline, right, in which the real Alice experiences the death of her family. We essentially remove the Lewis Carroll thing from the whole equation because I think it complicates and takes the focus away from where the focus is meant to be. The main character is Alice and her journey, and I know that there are a lot of sort of conversations that go around Lewis Carroll, his relationship with children, the pictures that you mentioned. I have always, as an author, as a creator, stayed out of that because it's not central to what it is I was trying to do with these stories.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I was just thinking that as a kind of visual medium, it almost seems like the game could be like the flip side of that, like something that's sort of healing.
Well, and I mean, it's an interesting topic, and I think it's someone could explore it at some point, but when I started out making the games, I was using that framework as a way to explore my own internal traumas and issues. And I think back then in 2000, there was maybe some beginnings of a sort of conversation around whether or not Carol's relationship with these children was proper or not. Certainly by the time we were making the second game, those conversations had grown a lot louder. But again, I found it wasn't helpful in context of us trying to tell her story because she was already an established character. Certainly, because this topic is one of child abuse or improper relationships, and then the same thing is happening in the game, one could eventually draw some parallels there. I just never tried to do it. If it comes out in the future that there's absolute proof that there was something wrong going on in these relationships between him, then of course that's terrible. And of course, the themes of the game would be relevant to that. And if it is the case, then I'm glad that we used his own work to demonize and damn that sort of behavior. But it was not, from the beginning, I want to be clear, it was never my intention because I'm not an interpreter of historical these things, right? And as you and I both know, cultural norms over time shift, and it's very difficult for us in the present to look back at certain things and know for certain whether or not those were inappropriate or not.
I think intention is so important when dealing with any kind of artistic creation involving mental illness, trauma, child abuse. And with that in mind, I just wanted to move over to the Plushie Dreadfuls and specifically the mental health Plushie Dreadfuls. How and why did you start creating those?
So it was much for the same reason that I began creating the Alice series of games. It is that as a creator, I'm drawing on personal traumas and emotions and things that draw from my childhood experience. And in the Alice games, during the opening scene of the first game, you see her laid on a bed with a plush white rabbit, what we call a distressed white rabbit, in her arms. That rabbit is the one that she is seen leaping out the window of her burning house with that in her hands. It's all she has left of her family. And it's patched and sewn, and it's got a button eye on one side and a missing eye on the other. At one point, I thought, why not make an homage to this, make something that is similar to it? Obviously not exactly the same because I don't own the Alice IP, but the notion of a distressed white rabbit is, fairly universal. So anyway, we made one of these and put it into our online shop, and it sold immediately. And then we made a few more and they all sold. And I thought, okay, well, people seem to really like this notion of rabbits. And as I began to think about, well, what is it that resonates with me and, the kind of projects I've done historically, I started thinking perhaps we could explore issues like PTSD as an example. It was one of the first ones that we did, and it was drawing off of my own personal experience with PTSD. Anxiety was another one, again, drawing from personal experience. And people loved them. They absolutely loved them. And we started making them before we fully understood what it was we were making. But we started to realize that there was so much in terms of therapeutic effect, in terms of community, in terms of awareness, in terms of acceptance, that it just started to inspire more and more. And people started requesting more and more themes. So it turned into a major business, as in it's a global thing now. And we have a community online that engages with the creation of these ideas. And it's really blossomed into something huge. And this year, I'm trying to work on further strengthening the ties to inner child work and healing and sort of just raising awareness around a lot of the connections between childhood trauma and adult mental or physical health issues.
I wanted to share something you wrote on your website specifically about the BPD rabbit. You said that it was probably the most requested rabbit before you came out with it, but that it took you a while to work up the courage to tackle it. I'm just curious about that process. How long was it between first hearing requests for it and then deciding to do it? And what made you particularly wary of tackling the borderline personality disorder rabbit?
So typically, if some group comes and asks for a design, we could work through the concept and what we called crowd design process and have a finished product shipping out to people in as little as maybe 3 months. That is from the first suggestion through crowd design online and then manufacturing and then being able to ship it. So that's probably the fastest we could get something out to people. In the case of some of these topics, like BPD being a good example, I think it took us nearly a year to complete that process. And there are a number of reasons why. So the initial reason is historically, we were trying to avoid tackling issues with which we did not, as a team, have direct personal experience. We had to sort of slowly work our way towards, for ourselves and also for our audience, accepting that our internal team not having direct experience, but using external reference and external teams that have experience, we had to work towards that being acceptable. That was the first thing. And there are still people, you can go online and you can see that there are people out there in the world who are not even happy about that. And that's fair. I do want to say up front, these toys and the notion of what we're doing is not universally accepted. There's a lot of people out there who see what we're doing, and despite all the caveats, they say, this is not for me, and I don't like this. And they will list off a lot of reasons why they think what we're doing shouldn't be done. Now, on the flip side of that, we obviously have a lot of people who write in and tell us that these things are very helpful and that it perfectly represents their experience. So during the crowd design process, what we're trying to do is push the design as far towards the direction of people feeling it's helpful and as far away from the side of people who think it's unhelpful, and trying to do that all while working in the limited canvas of a plush toy. There's only so much we can do in a plush toy. And so one of the things that will extend the crowd design process and make it more difficult for us is the concern about not touching on what are considered to be stereotypical representations of an issue. But one of the things I try to ask people to understand is that why things become stereotypical in the first place. What is the origin of the notion of something being stereotypical? Well, you can think about it in terms of a film production, right? When you're shooting a film, when you want to represent an illness, you cannot show the internal experience of the illness. You have to show the outward and most physical, vocal aspects of that illness. So it ends up that it is those easily portrayed visually and otherwise symptoms that we then go on to say, well, it's a stereotype, right? We have the same problem with our designs, is that it's a physical medium and there's a limitation to how much we can do in fabric and with stitching. And so to represent something and have it have meaning and connection, we often end up doing things that look like stereotypes. We try to navigate that by, again, including a community and making sure that the things we are including, while they may be stereotypes to some degree, at least aren't offensive stereotypes. I mean, again, there's a lot of variation in people's definitions of what is and isn't an offensive stereotype. But that process, that can cause the time to be more or less for a design. So when it came to BPD, our trepidation, our nervousness about it had to do with the fact that the experience of it can be so varied. Right. It's amongst a lot of the issues we've tackled. It's one where you can get a lot of variety in just the response to the idea that we might make the plush in the first place. And then also a lot of response in terms of the way people want to be represented. I'll just give you one example. It's the question of the representation of BPD between male and female segments of the population. There will be a lot of people who will say that it's represented heavily in one direction. And there will be a lot of people who say that's not fair. It ought to be in the other. I'm over here in this other segment. You're ignoring me. So that's just one aspect of it, right? So we have to very carefully navigate all of the competing voices and requests and desires in order to get to a final thing. And then once we get to a final thing, all the times there's a lot of people who are still not happy about it. So then we'll actually redo them. And that's something we've done now. We'll release an initial one. And when that sells out, we will completely redesign it and we'll release a new one. And then we can completely redesign that and release a new one, right? So, but I think that's cool because it sort of reflects the evolving nature of the understanding of these issues. And even since we began making these plushes, I've watched as the understanding for the origin, a lot of these issues has evolved over just the last couple of years. And it's interesting that it's happening around the same time that we're developing this line of plushes and they're raising awareness and increasing the conversations around them as well. I'm not taking credit for that. I'm just saying we exist in an interesting time for these conversations. So anyway, I know that's very long-winded, but I hope that answers your question.
I mean, there's so many fascinating things to take off from there. Just one quick question. Was there any particular feedback during the crowd design process that really surprised you? Or was there anything that stood out in terms of something that you would not have included or thought you would include?
I can't say there was anything particularly surprising. They all come with very large conversations, by and large. Actually, I could say that sometimes we put something up and everybody just loves it. And it's almost shocking to us. It's like, oh, we don't, okay, that design right out the gate, everybody loved it and it's fine. Now, of course, that'll happen in instances where it appears everyone loves it. And then as soon as we launch it, there's a whole group of people in the community who've never seen it prior. Right. They didn't know even about the crowd design and they latch onto it and they go, this is horrible. How dare you? Right. And so, we're not capturing an entire community when we open up crowd design. It is, of course, open to everyone, but not everyone's aware that we're even doing it in the first place. Back to BPD, I think one of the controversial aspects of it obviously would be the bomb backpack, right? But I remember the community went back and forth on that a lot. And I think it's really important to stress that we don't make the final decision on these things, right? We look at the comments across, TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all the places where feedback rolls in and we tally it up and we look at the votes. And a lot of times there'll be something that's controversial, like the bomb backpack, which makes me personally feel uncomfortable because I don't experience BPD, but when I look at that, I think, people may not like that. It's quite literal. It's quite on the nose. But then 80% of the community votes that they want it and they think it's great. What do we do? So it is the case that almost every one of the designs will end up with some point that's kind of contentious like that. But we leave it to the crowd. We leave it to the vote to decide whether it stays or goes. And that's not meant to wash our hands of responsibility for things in the designs that are inappropriate. We do try to exercise some degree of like a oversight. But when it comes to things like that, where even I feel it's a bit controversial, but that the community majority says, we love that, that's great, it's fun, please keep it, then we keep it, right?
In 1951, pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott came up with the term transitional object for those soft, beloved objects, usually a favorite stuffed animal or blanket, that we cling to as children. Typically, a transitional object allows us to disengage from dependence on our mother's presence and develop resilience when she's not there. It's not just children, though. One survey found that about a third of British adults sleep with a teddy bear. As an adult fan of stuffed animals, I know they can impart a sense of comfort, safety, and innocence. I derive a particular kind of comfort from my BPD Rabbit by Plushie Dreadfuls. When I first learned about it on a BPD-related subreddit, I was still developing a sense of humor about my BPD. That's not to say that I think BPD is a joke or that it's something that I take lightly. Not at all. But after decades of trying to avoid the stigmatized diagnosis, even colluding with the psychiatrist who treated me for years and pretending that I just had depression and anxiety, I needed to learn to coexist with it, especially now that I'm publicly dissecting my mental health history. I needed to learn to be less sensitive, lest every awful comment by an ignorant stranger made me wallow in misery for the rest of the day. So when I first read the description of the BPD Rabbit, including its ticking bomb backpack, and burst out laughing, it felt like a personal milestone. I knew I had to get one. As American and I talked about in the first part of our interview, not everyone likes the rabbit's representation of BPD, and that's completely fair. But for me, I wonder if it doesn't function as a transitional object that enables me to relinquish my attachment to a version of myself without BPD and accept the reality with grace and strength. Is it a transitional object for others, or maybe an externalization of inner pain, or a totem invested with magical powers to protect or heal, or maybe an embodiment of the parts of ourselves that we can't see as lovable unless they're fashioned into a cute bunny, or is it just a plush toy that feels nice to touch? American and I discussed the roles that the BPD Rabbit may perform for people and the value of inappropriate laughter in this second and final part of our interview.
I first found out about it. Someone was sharing a photo of the BPD Rabbit, and he said that he was so excited to get it. You know, one of the criteria for BPD is a sort of unstable sense of self. It doesn't mean everyone experiences that or experiences that in the same way, but he said he felt like the diagnosis gave him a kind of handle on his identity. And then the rabbit kind of gave a handle on that. It sort of reminded me of why I liked stuffed rabbits when I was little. I loved the story, The Velveteen Rabbit, which of course is about something becoming real through love. And I feel like there's something there with especially the BPD Rabbit, of maybe giving you a sense of something that you haven't had words for. It may be different for some people. Some people might want to look at that rabbit and say, okay, now I understand what I am. Maybe some people look at it and say, this is something outside of me. And it's not who I am. It's just something I have to deal with. And so it's having like an external, almost kind of totem could help. I think it's interesting that it could function in those different ways. We were talking a little bit before the interview about the idea of metaphors and mental illness, because I think basically the mental health rabbits, there are these fluffy metaphors for the condition, the ticking bomb backpack for BPD, or probably my favorite part of it is the pair of little bunnies, one black, one white, to emphasize black and white thinking. Because I know that for me, even though I would say I'm in functional recovery, I still struggle with black and white thinking. So even just having it as a kind of reminder, a cute reminder, feels helpful. So I think there are metaphors, and I don't think it's rare that we talk about mental illness and metaphors. There's one that I've shared with people that I heard about on the last BPD Awareness Day. That metaphor it asked people to imagine that they were born barefoot into a world strewn with broken glass while everyone else wore steel-toed shoes. That's sort of what it feels like to have BPD. And I thought, yeah, that really is what it's like. They might not agree with that, but I would think most people would be okay with that metaphor. I was definitely okay with the ticking time bomb, because for me, that was something I had felt. And just to see it and to be able to smile at it, to even have a kind of dark humor to it, which is something I tend to like, was helpful. But yeah, this line, when is a metaphor not helpful? I've heard people with BPD, especially women with it, described as, oh, they're the typical psycho ex-girlfriend. I mean, I think that's pretty clearly not a very helpful metaphor. So to you, what makes the BPD Rabbit a kind of more helpful metaphor rather than a stereotype to you? Like you said, you can't speak for other people. Is it just the intent and or that it was made with other people, is that a fundamental part of what keeps it on the side of good, I guess, for you?
The first thing I want to say is that in everything that you just said, I caught 20 different points of conversation that I would love to talk about. And the truth is that when I was making video games, I would do interviews about the meaning of the Alice games, and I would get that out in press and I would get it out in podcasts. I haven't really done interviews about the meaning of the Plushie Dreadfuls, or why it's something that's therapeutic for me and my team, or why we believe it may be therapeutic for other people. There's so much in what you just said about the generally toxic nature of the reality that we live in now. Even if you do not suffer traumatic childhood experiences, like on some sort of list of, real traumas, or however you define that, even just existence in the world that we're in these days leads people to a kind of, mental state. Our number one best-selling rabbit is the anxiety rabbit. Why is that, right? Like, what is the world that we live in nowadays that so many people resonate with the anxiety rabbit? I don't know. I could go off on a million tangents. I do want to say, in terms of the plush rabbit stuff, my sense is that whichever design it is, these are all sort of like emotional, psychological Trojan horses that allow themselves to be drawn into your safe space inside and embraced by your inner child, or however you want to label that part of you that's in there and it's damaged, or it's afraid, or it's hurt. And like you said, a lot of times when the metaphors contained in the rabbits, the designs are allowed to get into that space, they can help to unlock an understanding of, like, why am I this way? And a lot of times we don't realize why we are the way we are, especially because a lot of times the things that have caused us the trauma have also put up a kind of stealth shield around themselves, right? That you can't see past to even know that the things happened to you, much less understand how they affected who you are today as an adult and continue to affect you. So one of the things I imagine about these rabbits for myself and the people that appreciate them is that they do break down those barriers, and they do sometimes help you to recognize or accept some of these truths about yourself. To the point about what is or isn't a harmful stereotype, or what is or isn't something that someone wants to hear about the condition that they're suffering, I want to say this. I've been through a lot of traumas, and I've even gone through some adult traumas with my partner, my wife, and that were incredibly painful. And I understand that. I guess I understand it this way, and this may be wrong. The nearer you are to the event, that encounter with chaos, with that moment of trauma, the less able you are to joke about it, to have that dark sense of humor about it, to want to integrate it, right? You reject it, you push it away, you want nothing to do with it, and you don't even want to look at it. But I think that as time goes on, even the worst things that happen to us, we integrate it. You may never have to accept it or think that what happened was right or good in any way, but probably the greatest extent that, that the furthest you can go to the sign of integration with something like that, a trauma or something that's causing you pain internally, is getting to the point where you accept it to the extent that you can even joke about it, right? And I think that's a whole nother conversation about the function of humor, this notion, and we have it encapsulated in our culture of saying too soon, here's this horrible thing that happens, but then we can make a joke about it, and then you'll say, oh, too soon. Well, that's the truth. Like, a trauma happens to us or to the world we're in, and we expect that at some point it will no longer be too soon. But the point where it's no longer too soon is the point at which you've integrated it, and you've maybe not healed completely, but you're able to accept it, and you're able to look at it from the outside and even maybe joke about it. So I don't know, that to me explains, I think, why we get a spectrum of responses. And I hope that when people listen to what I just said, they're not trying to, they don't take it as my trying to minimize or delegitimize the pain and the suffering that they're experiencing. It's not that at all. And it's also not that people have to eventually get to the point where they feel comfortable with what's caused them their trauma. That I'm not saying that either. I'm just trying to make a metaphor to explain the metaphors. In our products.
You've had some good metaphors, like with the force shield sort of around our trauma that we set up. I do have one more question, but I just wanted to say two things quickly about what you just said. I think this whole idea of humor is so interesting. I lived in Poland for a while and went to, visited some of the concentration camps there. And the guide at Auschwitz said, it's okay if you have to have what you feel is an inappropriate response. He said to some people who are seeing these things, who are going through this place and feeling this place, because you definitely feel these places, the kind of just suffering and evil. He said some people laugh, and that's just their way of coping with it. But of course, other people might see them laughing and misunderstand that. There's always going to be that range of responses that, not everyone's going to understand how we're reacting. Other people won't react that same way. And the other thing is just, it's interesting because I feel like we've kind of come back around to the idea of internal family systems, because one of the ideas is that if you can integrate the different parts of yourself, you could even use parts of yourself to take care of the most wounded part. And I feel like for me, the BPD Rabbit, I've looked at some of the other ones, but I'm really just speaking to that one, is almost like trying to, it represents that wounded part that then I can care for, the part that wasn't just caused by childhood trauma, but also the trauma of having what has been for a long time a very stigmatized illness. Like you said, we are starting to see more conversations about BPD. We have researchers calling out to revise the attitudes that the medical community has about BPD, because often there's a lot of stigma even within medicine about it. So we are seeing that, but just having it can be kind of upsetting. But holding this cute animal, then I can kind of care for that part of myself. So that's been my reaction. But yeah, like you said, everyone will have a different response. And I think it's great that you've been working with the community. In terms of that response, that's actually my final question. Just are there any reactions to it that you've been really happy to hear?
Oh, absolutely, to the whole line of
Yeah.
products. In fact, so people end up mailing stuff to our business address. I don't want to show off like the name or anything, but like we get handwritten letters to our address in the US from people all over the world, and they're writing about a whole range of, this letter happens to deal with LGBTQ and ADHD and anxiety, but this person has found great comfort in the fact that there are these products and that they recognize this whole blend of things that they are dealing with. So we get physical written letters, private messages, and all kinds of things from people. And that is a huge for me, because we also do get pushback. We get negative feedback. And of course, you understand, everybody knows, sort of that one piece of negative feedback is like 100 pieces of positive.
Of course.
And I tend to take a lot of stuff like that very personally. Like, I don't want to do bad things in the world, and I don't want to hurt people, and I don't want people to feel bad about the products that we're producing. That's why historically I've, focused on mental health related products, the Alice games and other things that I've done. I want, through my experience and hopefully learning, like this conversation you've introduced me to the idea of the family systems, learning about things like that and trying to incorporate those things into the products that we're making, and hoping that, like, for example, this year we're going to try to build out resources on the website that introduce people to ideas like that and introduce them to places where they can go to seek conversations or therapy that utilize those methods. That's our goal. And I want to see this kind of response increase. I want to see more people helped by what we're doing, and see more positive feedback. And hopefully, it's not the main goal, but sort of try to convert, or at least calm some of the voices out there who are not happy about what we're doing. Right. So I hope this conversation with you does that a little bit. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about this in this format.
I hope so too. I mean, I wanted to talk to you because I'm talking to some different group that might provide resources deal with BPD, like talking to Jessie Shepard, who wrote a children's book called Millie the Cat Has Borderline Personality Disorder, which I think in a similar way might appeal to people as even adults as the BPD Rabbit does. I want to get those out there because there are certain people for whom having the rabbit could be a really positive thing. And just knowing about it, maybe, not for everyone, but it could be a coping mechanism. And I want to focus on that. And that's why I wanted to talk about it. And seeing even on the website, just comments from people saying that it's done that. Like just one woman saying that she bought it for her daughter who was coming to terms with her BPD diagnosis, and that just the comfort it gave her was priceless. So my hope is that a couple of people will hear this, will think about it, and that it will bring them some comfort. So thank you so much for talking to me. And any final things you want to say?
Oh no, I like I said, I think you and I could sit and talk about a lot of this
definitely.
stuff. Because there's so much, there is so much hiding inside of the designs and the metaphors and everything we choose. And so it's been really fun talking to you. And if in the future you do more of these conversations with the community and people that are doing things like this, I'd be happy to join in. Thank you so much.
That would be great. It would be interesting to have people who are creating products to help people cope with BPD that are a little more unusual. That sounds like a great idea. Thank you again, American.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cynthia.